whenever there's an equation like either 1, 2, or 3 actually, you get the x squared by itself, kind of like you do when it's just an x. Okay? So on number 1, I think I would subtract 9 on both sides, because I'm just going to get the x squared by itself. Okay? Here's where it matters about the square roots. So if I want to know what x is, if x squared is 16, what I do is I take the square root on both sides. Okay? Square root of x squared, the square root and the square kind of cancel out, you get x. What's the square root of 16? 4. And what you do is you put plus or minus with it. The reason for doing that is because if you think about it, 4 times 4 is 16, right? But negative 4 times negative 4 is also 16, right? So when we're solving these equations, we have to say that x is both the positive and the negative. If I just ask you what's the square root of 16, you're going to tell me 4. But if I ask you to solve an equation and you get square root of 16, then the answer has plus or minus, because both the 4 and the negative 4 work in the equation. Okay? Questions on that one? Okay, so number 2. What do you think we would do first? Add 6, because we're just going to do it like a normal equation at first. Okay, what do you think we do next? Okay. Alright, so what did we do on both sides when we had x squared equals something over here?
Square root.
Square root it, so we're going to put square root here. So I know that equals x. Okay, square root of 5. You think about the 5. Can you divide the 5 by anything? 5 is as simple as it can get, so you leave it as square root of 5, but you put a plus or minus in front of it. You just have to remember that when you get to the end and take the square root, you put plus or minus in front of the answer. Okay, number 3. What do you think you would do first?
Plus 8.
Add 8. Alright. Then what? What do we do next? Divide by 4. Good. Alright, and then what?
Square root.
Square root. Square root of x squared is just x.
Square root.
Okay, so we put plus or minus. Always plus or minus. Alright, square root of 5, it doesn't break down, but it does have a negative in front of it, so that means there's an I. And then square root of 5 is separate. Questions about that? I'm going to give you one more to try. So let's look at number 4. This one's a little bit different because it doesn't have the x squared by itself. Okay? But it has a parenthesis around the x minus 2, so what I want to do is I want to get x minus 2 by itself. Okay? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take the square root on both sides, kind of like that. And that's because the square is outside of everything. Okay? So when I take the square root, what happens is that on this side I just get x minus 2 because the square root and the square kind of go away. Alright? Now over here on the right, where you have the square root of negative 25, you have to put your plus or minus. Okay? What is the square root of 25? 5. We already know. And what about that negative that's there? I. Okay? So, whenever you have something that's squared, you can take the square root on both sides before you have to do anything else. And then you try to get x by itself from there. So what would we do from there on both sides? Add 2 on both sides. So we would get plus or minus 5i plus 2. I would be okay with your answer written that way. I will tell you most of the time you'll see your answer written like this, 2 plus or minus 5i. But if you do not rewrite it, that would be okay. Normally, it's the number and then whatever's with I if there is a I. Okay? Questions about that one? Okay? Let's look at number 5. So on number 4, the square was already by itself. Okay? Number 5, the square is not by itself. There's a bunch of other things going on. So kind of the same way that we try to solve for x, you're trying to solve for the square. So I'm going to do something with this 21. And then I'm going to do something with the 3. And then my square will be by itself, and maybe I could take the square root on both sides. Okay, so what would you do first? Add 21 on both sides. Is that 108?
Yep.
Okay. And then you do what?
Divide by 3.
Divide by 3. Or 6 maybe. And now that the x minus 4 squared is all by itself, I can take the square root on both sides, like I did on the problem before it. So at that point, I'm going to take the square root. The square root and square kind of go away, so over here I get x minus 4. What do you think you get with the square root of 36?
6.
Don't forget something really, really important.
Plus
Plus
minus.
or minus. Okay? Now, because 6 is just a regular old number, we're actually going to get real answers. We're not going to get i's and square roots. Okay? So when I add 4 on both sides, this is what you have to do. You do positive 6 plus 4, which is 10. And you do negative 6 plus 4, which is negative 2. Because the problem said plus or minus 6, that means 6 is positive or 6 is negative, and I have to add 4 in both cases. So my two answers on number 5 are 10 and negative 2, and you only have to do that when you get a number here. But if you get an I, then you just leave it. Okay? Questions about that one? Alright, so subtract 9. And then take the square root. Don't forget to do plus or minus. We know that the square root of 16 is 4, so plus or minus 4. And then we're going to add 2. How do I actually get my answers?
Negative 4 plus 2 and 4 plus 2.
Negative 4 plus 2 and positive 4 plus 2. Okay, so number 7. There's something tricky about this one once you take the square root. So you get x plus 4 squared equals negative 8. Right? Square root on both sides. Alright, this is where the tricky part is. It's square root of negative 8. I don't know what the square root of 8 is. I do know there's going to be an I because of the negative. But because I don't know the square root of 8, and because there's more I can do with 8. You know, up there on number, I don't remember, 4 maybe, I think we left it as a square root of 5. Well, 5 was a prime number. There wasn't anything else to do to 5. Well, 8 is one of the problems where we have to divide and do the whole process. So divide 8 by 2, you get 4. Divide by 2, you get 2. And so you have a pair of 2's and an extra 2. So here you're going to get 2i square root of 2 for the square root of negative 8. Okay, so before you keep going, go ahead and figure out, is the square root of this number something I know, or is it something I need to break down to make it simpler? Okay, and then to get x by itself, what am I going to do next? Subtract 4, and then I'll have my answer. And don't forget, I forgot it almost, the plus or minus in front of the 2i square root of 2, because that was the side I took the square root on. Let's talk about number 8 and number 9. So on number 8, the first thing we would do is add 16 on both sides. And you do get 56. Divide by 2 on both sides. And you get 28. Okay? This is where we start doing the square roots because we have the square by itself, so we square root on both sides. Alright, and then we got to come out here to the side and break down that 28. You can divide it by 2. Divide by 2 again and you get a 7, so we have a pair of 2's and a 7. Don't forget your plus or minus. And then you subtract 1, or add 1. And that's the answer. There's nothing else you can do to it because you can't add 1 to the square root. The only time that you do another step after that is if the square root or the I was not there. If that was just plus or minus 2 plus 1, then you would figure out the 2 answers. Okay? Number 9. We're going to add 8 on both sides. Divide by 2. Take the square root. Alright, 5 is not something that we can break down. It's not something that we know, so we leave it underneath the square root. Except what we do with the negative, make an I, and don't forget the plus or minus. Then you subtract 1 on both sides. And then that's the answer.